This is Bart Peterson, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Greg Gilchrist, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Dan DeMarco, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
The FCPA Compliance Report is the longest-running podcast in compliance, engaging a wide variety of compliance-related guests and topics. Each week, Tom Fox brings you the top commentators and information which will inform your compliance program going forward. Join us again for the top podcast in compliance, hosted by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
In today's episode, I visit with Tony Charles. Tony is the Chief Client Officer at Steele Compliance Solutions. We consider the recently released Steele white paper, Third-Party Due Diligence, creating a credible and defensible program. Due diligence is a topic that is always on the forefront of compliance practitioners' minds, and this paper and Tony's podcast will give you several different ways to think through both automated due diligence, how to tier your due diligence, how to do a risk assessment around due diligence, and due diligence going forward. I know you'll enjoy this episode.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, back for another episode. And today I have with me Tony Charles. Tony is the Chief Clients Officer at Steele, and we're going to take up a topic that has been around in compliance for quite some time, that being third parties and due diligence, but a topic that's still on the front of minds of many compliance practitioners. So, Tony, first of all, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thanks so much, Tom. Really appreciate you having me.
Tony, the thing that kind of led to this podcast was just an excellent white paper delivered by Steele to the compliance community entitled Third-Party Due Diligence, Creating a Credible and Defensible Program. I wanted to start with that document and ask, what was the genesis of that document from Steele to the greater compliance community?
It's actually a white paper that we've put out before, and it's updated fairly regularly. But to your point, this is a topic that's been around for a long time, and I'll tell you, it's always a topic of great interest. So thanks for reaching out to talk it through. We've had the privilege of serving hundreds of large multinational companies in both in the development and the ongoing support of their third-party management programs. And it was always interesting. I asked myself the question, why do we see companies invest more in their third-party due diligence programs when, they're under scrutiny, right? They're either being investigated or they're preparing to self-disclose. That's not all companies. Certainly many companies are investing in their programs outside of that sort of pressure. But it is interesting that and it seems like an obvious answer, but what I find so interesting is that when you read the guidance, you read the publications from Justice and SEC, for example, the 2012 guidance or the last year's guidance on corporate compliance programs from Justice, or you read some of their counterparts in foreign jurisdictions like the AFA's guidance from 2 years ago, it's really easy to see what regulators and law enforcement regimes are looking for. And what they look for is, clearly risk-based due diligence on third parties. And we see that there's a lot of confusion in the market as we talk to multinational corporations about their programs. Certainly, third parties as a whole represent a large risk. You're probably well aware of the Stanford Law School in collaboration with Sullivan and Cromwell. They have a great website called the FCPA Clearinghouse. Some really fantastic stats on existing and publicly available information on existing cases, FCPA cases. And that shows that 90% of FCPA disclosed cases over the history of the FCPA involve third parties in those actions. And so, again, it really reinforces the importance of third-party due diligence, especially given how difficult third parties can be, right, in managing compliance. By definition, they're operating outside of your company, and so, but yet they're operating on behalf of your company. So they can be hard to manage. So those are really, I think, the core reasons we're looking at providing this kind of information.
Tony, where should a company or compliance practitioner begin to think through this process?
Let me break it into two different sort of starting points. When you talk about where should someone start, I think the first is the obvious, right? When a company doesn't have a program or their program is very basic, say, policies and procedures only. Maybe there's, it's really a paper program, so little oversight. Their internal controls may be quite, not quite as strong as they need to be. That's the obvious. But I think another important starting point, I'll use air quotes there on starting point, should be kind of during the normal course of a compliance department's regular review, whether that's annually or some other periodicity. And I say this is another starting point because, every compliance program should be reviewed on a regular basis. And companies should obviously be benchmarking their program if they can with peer companies. And you'll hear this constantly from me, right? We have a roadmap from regulators. And if you look at last year's Justice Department document, the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, I think it was published at the end of April, there's an entire section entitled Continuous Improvement, Periodic Testing and Review. I often review or refer to the standard form attachment in, Department of Justice DPAs and NPAs, and you can find these on their website. You look at that attachment C, it's about corporate compliance programs, and the last section talks all about monitoring and testing and making sure your compliance program is contemporary, that it's meeting, it's keeping up with industry and international standards. And the language is vague, but that ensures the document stands for a long time and really speaks to the importance of continuously updating the program. So all that to say, when you're looking at where to begin, it's not just for companies who don't have something yet. It's a concept that should be employed by all companies, periodically. And so we can address your question sort of, or to address your question, let me break it into three groups. Sort of, how do you begin? You begin with planning, implementing, and executing. Right. So planning really includes a company assessing where they're at, conducting that gap assessment or gap analysis, looking at their whole third-party compliance framework. There's a lot to include in that, Tom. There are so many elements that you need to consider: third-party risk criteria, what information you want to collect from the third party, how are you going to collect that information, what aspects of your contracting, for example, might you need to review or potentially update, such as audit clauses and contracts with higher risk third parties. How do you ensure your program isn't going to implicate other statutes such as GDPR? We have the new California Consumer Protection Act, the CCPA. These are things that our clients, we're constantly working with our clients on. How do you ensure that the third party understands its compliance obligation? For example, how do you employ training? And I think one of the really important ones is what do you measure? How do you define your KPIs? And so I think there's a lot to consider in the planning stage. One of the areas that I think companies underestimate the level of effort that it's going to take to get their arms around is data. And I'm sure you've seen this, Tom, in your own career and working with companies and talking with companies. It's an incredibly complex arena when you look at data, especially for larger companies where they're growing through acquisition. They have many different data sources. The data is rarely consistent. It's rarely normalized, meaning one part of the business calls a third party type one thing, while another calls it something completely different. The nomenclature is not the same. It makes it quite challenging, and so data is one of those areas I think that's really important to get your arms around. That's I think the sort of the core of the planning piece, and then you get into the implementation stage. And we always suggest and consult clients to really engage a multifunctional team frankly, even at the planning stage, but especially at the implementation stage. It's so critical that you get the different functions that are going to be involved in and touch or be affected by your compliance program in the stage before you're executing the program. So IT, finance, procurement, legal, compliance, obviously the business, all of these functions really need to be involved early and often in the planning and execution or in implementation, so that when you get to execution, all key stakeholders are already well aligned to the program. And then finally, execution. I think, that it seems obvious, but, you get the program rolling. Part of that, it needs to include auditing and monitoring the program, making sure it's effective. I mean, this is one of the hallmarks, right, of this new sort of this Department of Justice guidance that says, does your program work? Is the program effective? And how do you measure effectiveness, right? So this is probably a good place to introduce the importance of analytics. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is. I don't think there's ever been as strong a call to action as there is today to make your program data-based. And again, you think about the new DOJ guidance that asks one of those fundamental questions: does the program work? And you can't answer that without implementing a robust analytics component to your program. So, I think the theme or the moral of that is a well-designed program should consider the KPIs in advance of implementation. It should be part of the design of the program. So you're looking ahead and planning for what are you going to try to answer long term.
Tony, what do you see as the levels of due diligence?
There's really three distinct levels, Tom, and then there's lots of combinations and permutations, in between each level. But at the core, there's sort of three basic levels. There's the database level. This is an automated check where you're plugging names into some sort of system, and it's running, it's screening against whatever lists or data sets are available in that particular system. Something most companies are doing anyway, right? These are standard checks. Procurement is often already doing these. Finance is doing these using, Dun & Bradstreet or whomever to do their standard checks. That's the basic level. The next level is a human level analysis at open source. So it can get confusing sometimes in the investigation world. Open source intelligence, or OSINT, is often referred to. It can be considered partly automation, but in this world of corporate compliance, we generally consider open source intelligence human analyst derived and driven. So someone who's actually looking for information, analyzing, assessing that, curating that information into some sort of due diligence report. And then finally, the field-based human intelligence. So again, the three levels are sort of database checks, which are automated, and then open source or field level. I'll start with the field level, just sort of to describe sort of the advantages and disadvantages, right? So clearly, field level it's the most robust. They're deep. It's local. If you're doing it right, you've got local resources looking into that third party history and any potential risk areas or red flags. What's one of the most important things to consider, because there are so many sort of pitfalls or potential landmines in the conduct of field investigations, especially when you're sending someone out to actually conduct that work on the ground. You want to make sure that you're following, you're only collecting information that's legally obtainable. And there are a number of examples that we've seen in the past where companies have fallen sort of afoul of various laws locally. Probably one of the most well-publicized cases was the GSK case, and Peter Humphreys, owner of China Wise, who was representing GSK, and he and his wife ended up in jail for a couple of years in China. And it was a highly publicized case, but they were accused of procuring information illegally, et cetera. So, the idea that you're gathering information that's legally obtainable, you're following our local laws is really critical. So that's one important aspect to consider. But with that said, field investigation clearly gives you the best information possible based on a sort of a composite perspective of what you can identify from a risk standpoint on a third-party relationship. You're getting deeper information. You're getting it locally. Often you're getting information that you just can't seem to get elsewhere. So those are the sort of big picture advantages. Disadvantages: cost. It's going to be the more expensive, right? The more you look for, the more it's going to cost. There's a time component. It takes longer because you're looking for more. It's a broader scope. But as I said, there's some real advantages to it as well. So it needs to be employed in the right context, and maybe I'll talk about that in a moment. But I'll continue with sort of the next level, which is sort of the desktop-based or web-based research. And that's a great application across your medium risk third parties, or maybe your medium to high, to for the lower high end if you have a multi-tier risk model. This is there's some great advantages to web-based. You're getting a much deeper information than you get from databases. You're getting, if it's done right, you have a multilingual analyst looking at both local media as well as international media in both local language and English. These are lower cost for sure, significantly lower. But they're also, from a disadvantage, you can't apply it across your entire population. It's just not practical, again, because of the expense. But these are typically, several $100s sort of thing. So you're not going to apply that to tens of thousands of third parties necessarily. You can certainly, though, get some really great benefit from applying it to that medium risk tier of third parties. I think the database checks have been a great addition to the conduct of due diligence for corporations as the technologies emerged. We employ an AI-driven or artificial intelligence-driven technology within our platform to help companies screen the masses of third parties that they have. So someone might have 30 or 40 or 50,000 third parties, even 5 or 10,000 third parties. It's a significant number of relationships that you don't want to, you can't afford to do the higher level due diligence, but this gives you a meaningful look into the potential risk areas for your lower risk relationships. So I think that's probably a good summary of the three levels that I would consider for due diligence, Tom.
Tony, could you describe what is investigative tiering?
Yeah, that's really just another way of saying risk-based due diligence. And it refers to the sort of processes we've been discussing around, conducting a risk assessment and then applying the appropriate level of diligence to the level of assessed risk for the third party. Why do we do this, right? Really, you do this partly for efficiency. Certainly the most effective compliance program would conduct a field investigation on every third party. But as I mentioned, they're expensive, and that's obviously not practical. It's not reasonable due diligence, and that's an important adjective, I think, for all of us to consider in compliance. Programs still need to be reasonable. And so, we do conduct this level of course on higher risk third parties. Generally, that's parties operating in high-risk businesses in high-risk jurisdictions, because the higher the diligence, as I mentioned before, the more you're likely to find. And it's important to do that, to vet your high-risk third parties with this sort of level of due diligence. I mean, let's consider the Unaoil case from a few years ago. And Tom, I know you have a long history in the oil and gas industry, so I'm sure you've paid close attention to Unaoil and sort of the havoc they've wreaked on for many multinational companies. Many companies, Honeywell, Baker Hughes, KBR, Rolls-Royce, have all had some nexus to Unaoil, and it's been well publicized. And here you look at a company that's posted on their website for many years that they had compliance certifications, and there was really no way that I'm aware of that you could have identified very easily the risk based on sort of public documents or online sources, at least using the standard tools that investigators use today. And a field investigation, while it may not have found it, it would have been the most effective way if you're conducting a rigorous reputation assessment to potentially find some risk associated with Unaoil. That's sort of tried and true, sort of old school investigation techniques out on the field. But those work, and that really helps. And I think the reputation assessment is one of the most valuable components of a field investigation. Really asking questions in an investigative way to try to uncover potential areas that may need to be further investigated, but they lead to intelligence that can really help uncover a risk that wouldn't otherwise be obvious. So I think that's the basic concept of investigative tiering, right? Applying the right level of diligence to the associated risk level of the third party.
Tony, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I was wondering if you might give a few more words on the investigative framework that you lay out in the white paper.
It really refers to a methodical approach to conducting due diligence, really to answer the same business questions, such as I just mentioned, the reputation of the third party, but regardless of jurisdiction. And there's nuance in this. The nuance is that you may have to employ different tactics based on the region or the type of third party, or the type of relationship that they're engaged in with you, or et cetera. And so, another standard part of our field level investigation is a site assessment. The site assessment is really about trying to understand if this entity or this third party relationship or this third party is able to do what they say they're supposed to do, right? This is something that you even see in the FCPA resource guide from 2012. There are a number of questions that ask that the Justice Department and SEC say you should be able to ask the questions or answer the questions. Does this company have the means to do what you're hiring them to do? And so a site assessment is doing just that. It's helping to do that, right? It's looking at their operations. It's asking, is there, do they actually exist where they say they exist? Does the size of the operation corroborate with the supposed action they're going to take on your behalf? And so, we've seen situations where a supposed office is actually a women's restroom, or an empty field. I remember one case where it was an empty field that they registered their office, or they suggested was their office, or a really dingy apartment in a bad part of town. I remember one company, it was just you said, how can they do this? They were supposedly going to generate tens of millions of dollars in business activity for a client, and it just didn't comport with the location. So we also look at, well, maybe it looks all fine, but it's the middle of the work week and there's nobody in the office, that sort of thing. So what you're looking for in the conduct of the investigation is important. Yet, in some countries, in the context of this idea of investigative framework and how you're going after the same information, but having to take a local nuanced approach, in some countries, for example, in the Middle East, you can get stopped and detained or even arrested by authorities if you're caught taking pictures of a business operation out in the open. I mean, it really comes down to really understanding what the local cultural nuances are and local laws to make sure you're not doing anything illegal as well. So that's the general concept behind investigative framework. Maybe I'll give you one more. Another good example is in China. When you're conducting open source investigations in China, we all know that there's some information available online in China that may not be available outside of China, due to, in essence, what the PRC is sort of containing information. You often hear dubbed the Great Firewall. And so this concept of the Great Firewall, that some information isn't able to get into China and some information isn't able to get out of China. For that reason, we have analysts in China on the ground as well as outside, and we try to be able to deliver information, from both inside and outside of the country. But that's another example of employing this investigative framework.
Tony, I'd like to turn now to the issue of technology. And where do you see the critical components of an automated system around third parties and due diligence?
I think, like most things, this can seem basic on the surface. As you dig in, though, you start to realize there's a really lot to consider. So things like how do you automate the collection of information from the third party, whether that's through due diligence questionnaires or some other mechanism, collecting legal attestations for your anti-corruption declaration, automating the process of risk assessing and defining the requirements of the third party relationship with your company, based on potentially a lot of different criteria, how you're engaging with that third party, their jurisdiction or country level. The most common there is using the corruption perception index, looking at various other aspects to build that risk assessment. These requirements could then drive things like your contract provisions, or the level of training that you want to provide, or that's required for that third party to take, the level of due diligence that you want to conduct or need to conduct on that third party, et cetera. So there's a lot that you can automate through that. A big part of automated due diligence centers on the type of information and data sets that you're going to then use. So you sort of, when you think about automation, you think about the onboarding, managing, and monitoring of that third-party relationship. So sort of from the onboarding, kind of what I've just described, collecting information, risk assessing that third party, conducting certain levels of due diligence. Part of that is also automated due diligence. So sanctions and watch lists, politically exposed persons data, SOE, state-owned enterprise data, negative news screening, defining which lists you want to screen by different types of third parties, defining who's going to adjudicate the results. There's just a tremendous amount of false positives that company might need to sort of swim through, which means you need to really plan ahead on how you're going to automate your due diligence, so that you're not overwhelmed with false positives that need to be cleared. We provide the service for clearing for our clients just because it's such an area of need for companies. They don't have the headcount to support that kind of effort. So it's pretty common in the industry to have that service. And then finally, as I referenced above, before, analytics. What reports do you want your automation to provide on a regular basis? Do you need these reports on a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly basis, et cetera? And I think this is really, again, as I mentioned before, the linchpin to ensuring that you have an effective program. One that's credible and defensible is having the right reports being generated on a regular basis to help you run your program effectively.
Tony, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time, but we're going to link to this great resource in our show notes. But if our listeners wanted any more information on third parties, due diligence, any of the concepts or ideas or topics that you've raised in this podcast, where could they go?
I think the easiest thing, Tom, is for listeners to go to steeleglobal.com, and that's STEELE global.com. You can click on Request a Demo, and you'll get contacted by one of our folks who can, they'll seek to understand your need, and they'll get you connected with the right folks.
So, Tony, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to visit with me. Our listeners do not know, but we've tried to do this several times, and I'm glad we were finally able to get a recording down. This has been a fascinating podcast on a topic that, like I said, has been around. I've been in compliance since 2006, and it's always been in the forefront of mind. So I wanted to thank you for helping us work through this topic today.
Thank you for having me, Tom. I greatly appreciate it. I've watched and admired your work for many years, and it's a pleasure to speak with you today.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. Thank you for listening to this episode. I'm going to link to the Steele White Paper Third-Party Due Diligence, Creating a Credible and Defensible Program. You should definitely download the white paper. It provides a lot more information than we were able to touch on in this podcast. Also, if you have not done so, please rate our podcast on iTunes, as it would help in our rankings. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you'll join me again next week.